So I'm going to move straight on now to my main presentation of the evening on Cuba. And I've called this Target One Earth, living within our footprint and what we can learn from Cuba. In 2007, the World Wildlife Fund published a State of the Planet report, where they looked at over 100 different nations on planet Earth and found Cuba the only nation to achieve both the United Nations Human Development Index, sort of a high, almost first world level, there in terms of sort of health, longevity, housing, literacy, etc. And so to achieve that and live within its ecological footprint. So when I visited Cuba in 2008 as part of the Cuba-Australia Permaculture Exchange, I was there for 40 days and visited 40 projects and travelled the full length and breadth of Cuba, as well as the permaculture work. I was also looking at Cuba and, well, what's involved in actually living within our ecological footprint. Because it's something that, well, it's really difficult for us to imagine. And just, you know, what a footprint means. Well, if everyone lived like a Cuban, that's everybody on planet Earth lived like a Cuban, we could sustain our current population, global population, with the resources of one planet Earth. Now, if everybody lived like an Australian, we'd need 3.7 planets. If everybody lived like the average American, we'd need 5.4. If everybody lived like the average person in the United Arab Emirates, we'd need over 7 planets. And we've only got one. So what does a single planet, footprint, lifestyle look like? What have we actually got to contract back to? Because if we're realistic, learning to live within our ecological footprint is the only sustainable solution to the converging impacts that we have of climate change, peak oil, peak water, peak population, peak speculation, peak phosphate, lead, fisheries, topsoil, forests, consumption, debt, development. I mean, we're peaking out on all fronts. We're passing thresholds and tipping points. In the last 50 years, we as a species have consumed more resources than in more than 200,000 years of human society. That is not sustainable. And to live within our footprint as Australians, we'd actually need to reduce our consumption across the board by 70%. That's a lot. I mean, some people consume more than others, and in Australia, like in America, there's a considerable percentage of the population that are struggling to make ends meet, which means that there's, you know, a lot of people that have got very, very big footprints. But looking at Cuba, I mean, Cubans didn't choose to live within their ecological footprint. Cuba's footprint arose from a very unique set of circumstances. And first of all, you've got a socialist ideology that puts people before profits. You've got a national social security system, so essential needs like food, health, education are provided for. The government has great capacity for state regulation. The US blockade of sanctions have had a huge impact on Cuba and still do. And then there was Cuba's response to the special period when the USSR collapsed, and overnight they lost their access to fossil fuels. 70%. And they lost their export market for their crops. When the petrol stations ran out of fuel, there was no more. When the stores ran out of food, there was no more. And pretty much overnight, the nation needed to learn to stand on its own feet. Cubans weren't a society of gardeners. They had no tradition of traditional food-producing systems to fall back on. Their agriculture was even more chemical and energy intensive than that of the US in the 1980s, early 90s. Completely dependent on Russian fuel, pesticides, fertilizers, etc., etc. It was all plantation agriculture. Prior to the revolution, of course, it was all, colonial plantation agriculture. Before that, it was slave-based plantation agriculture. So there isn't really this culture of small farming and subsistence agriculture and so forth that many third world countries have. So they had to actually learn from scratch how to grow food. And over the years, over the decades since then, it's pretty remarkable how Cuba has managed to meet the challenges of living with a severely restricted resource base on a small island. And yet at the same time, they've actually increased the amount of forest. And that they've managed to do that without destroying their environment, I think is pretty amazing. When we look at the history of Cuba's footprint, we find that after the revolution in 1959, the top line there, we see it steadily rising. And by the early 70s, they had actually reached a one Earth footprint, but then there was the oil crisis of the 1970s, and so we see a slump there. With the recovery and through the 80s, towards the late 80s, actually starting to rise up well above a single Earth footprint, then the special period hit. And what a crash. And a long, slow road to recovery. And by 2007, actually attaining, being just under on the threshold of a single planet footprint. So how does Cuba do it? Security for essential needs, decentralisation of essential services, interesting modes of transport, simple lifestyle, frugality, the dual currency and consumption restraints are very interesting to consider. There's the energy revolution, and then there's just, good old generosity of spirit, which is from the neighbourhood level, between neighbours, but right through to the government level. Cuba actually has more doctors in third world countries around the world than the World Health Organization.